Om Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om, lead us from the transient to the eternal. Lead us from darkness to light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you again after a long hiatus. It's been a few months, I think. In the previous sessions, we did the art of karma yoga. We've done the art of bhakti yoga. We've got two left from the standpoint of Vedanta. There are four main yogas. There are more than that, of course, but four main ones. And we've covered two out of the four. Today, we're discussing Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. And then maybe in the future, we'll discuss Raja Yoga, the path of meditation and concentration. So, what is the path of knowledge? How is it relevant to us? And yeah, what can we learn from the path, and how do we incorporate it into our daily life? So that's kind of what I'll try to talk about. And I want it to be a discussion. So if you have any questions at any point, just ask me. But okay, the first thing to keep in mind is Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. Um, Generally, people associate it with a particular school, with a particular philosophical tradition, namely Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Okay, are most of you familiar with Shankara's philosophy? Yeah, I'll talk briefly about what that is. Um, yeah, maybe we should, well, before I get into that. But there are other forms of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, and one other form of it you find in a Bhakti school of Vedanta called Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, the qualified non-dual Bhakti philosophy of Ramanuja. He also talks about the path of knowledge, but he defines it a bit differently than Shankara does. So we'll talk actually about both of those kinds of Jnana Yoga. And then we can talk about what the pros and cons of each one is. And then you can decide for yourself which one you want to practice, if either, and that kind of thing. So before I get into that, though, I wanted to mention on a personal note that as a spiritual aspirant, when I was in grad school at Berkeley, um, I uh, I was agnostic as an undergrad through my whole undergrad, and then also for most of my grad school, actually, master's and PhD. But I was a spiritual seeker at the same time. So I was an agnostic spiritual seeker. And the first spiritual tradition that really gripped me and kind of like, I would say, woke me up from my agnostic slumber was Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. I read Swami Vivekananda's complete works, and I read it through the lens of Shankara, thinking that he was just teaching Shankara. Later, I kind of developed a different interpretation of Vivekananda's teachings, but at that time, it was pure Shankara. And I'm reading Shankara's own commentaries and writings about Advaita Vedanta, and I found them very inspiring. Um, and I get it. I get the appeal because of that, because I went through it myself. Um, a few of the reasons why I think Advaita Vedanta is so appealing is it's like it's sublime. There's something very sublime in the idea that you're not the body, you're not the mind, you are non-dual, pure consciousness. Nothing else exists. And all you have to do is know your true nature. That's it. Nothing else. And you don't need to believe in anything. You don't need to blah, blah, blah. This kind of thing. So that really appealed to me. I'm a philosopher or a budding philosopher, and I pride myself on reasoning and rationality. And so I thought, and I was like, oh, so I can still stay an agnostic and still be spiritual at the same time, right? I don't even need to believe in a God. I don't need to rely on blind faith, right? These kinds of, I was thinking along these lines. And I also wanted to, share with you one of the classic Advaitic texts or some verses from one of the classic Advaitic texts. Um, One second. There we go. Some of the verses. Okay, so right at the very beginning of this text, the treatise is called Ashtavakra Samhita. Have any of you watched any of Sarvapriyananda, Swami Sarvapriyananda's lectures? Besides you, I know you have, but anyone you have, right? A few of you have, yeah. So he gives classes on Ashtavakra Samhita. This is one of his favorite texts. And it was also one of my favorite texts. Um, So I'm reading to you a couple verses from that, and you'll get a sense of um, what Advaita Vedanta is about and why it's so inspiring. So, verse 4 of Ashtavakra Samhita. Yadi deham pratakritya chiti vishrami tishtasi adunaiva sukhi shanto bandhamukto bhavishyasi. If you detach yourself from the body and rest in pure consciousness, you will at once be happy, peaceful, and free from bondage. At once, right? That's another important thing. Adunaiva, right now. You don't need to, it's not a long, protracted process. Literally, the moment you realize yourself as pure consciousness rather than the body, you become free. Okay. Um, Spiritual life feels very easy in a certain sense. When you read these kinds of verses, it's like you just watch one of Sarva Banerjee's lectures, you feel like just within a couple seconds or minutes, I'll be there, right? It's like he's holding it out to you, that mukti. Another verse, this is verse 6 of the same scripture. Dharma dharmo sukham dukkham manasani nate vibho nakartasi na bhoktasi mukta evasi sarvada. Virtue and vice, pleasure and pain. Actually, virtue, this is, I'm using Nitya Swarupanandaji's translation, but actually, dharma and adharma, I think it's better to translate them as merit and demerit. Like it's based on the doctrine of karma. So the idea is if you do something, a dharmika action, it produces dharma, which is this kind of positive uh, quotient or something, karmic quotient, which then results in favorable circumstances later in this life or in a future life, and vice versa. So anyway, I would say karmic merit and demerit, sukham dukkham, pleasure and pain or happiness and sadness. Manasani nate vibho. They are of the mind. They belong to the mind. They don't belong to you. Nate vibho. Nakartasi na bhoktasi mukta evasi sarvada. You are neither the doer nor the enjoyer. You are verily ever free. You are ever liberated. You're always liberated. You're eternally liberated. You don't even need to seek liberation because you were never bound. Um, Another verse. Verse 10. Yatra vishvamidam bhati kalpitam rajju sarpavat. Ananda paramananda sabodastvam sukham chara. That pure consciousness in which this universe appears like a snake superimposed upon a rope. So the snake is an illusion and the rope itself is real. Is bliss, supreme bliss. You are that supreme consciousness. Be happy, right? So these verses are very inspiring. This is one of Ramakrishna's and Vivekananda's favorite verses, verse 11. Mukta bimani mukto hi baddho baddhabimanyapi. Kim vadanti satyayam yamati sagatir bhavet. One who considers oneself free is free indeed. And one who considers oneself bound remains bound. As one thinks, so one becomes, is a popular saying in this world, which is too true. Okay. This is something that Sri Ramakrishna would often quote. And he would, it was especially in the context of British colonial India, when there are a lot of Christians and Christian missionaries. And there's this very popular Hindu reform movement at the time called the Brahma Samaj. And they were also strongly influenced by Christianity. And so both Christianity and this Brahma Samaj are all talking about being sinners, original sin, and we're sinners, papi, papi, we're papis. And Sri Ramakrishna, that kind of will say, don't keep calling yourself sinners. The more you dwell on sin, the more likely it is you'll continue to sin, right? Always think of yourself as divine and free. And then he'll quote this kind of verse, you know? So these are very powerful verses. Um, And as I said, when you read these Advaita texts, they're so inspiring, so sublime, so uplifting that you feel like, or you watch one of Sarva Banerjee's lectures or something, and you feel like it's so simple. Spiritual life is so simple, right? All you have to do is detach yourself from the body or break your identification with the body and with the mind and identify as pure consciousness, right? But it's not that simple. And that's something that, uh, again, on a personal note, after a few years of trying to practice Advaita Vedanta, I became a brahmacharin, a monastic novitiate in India after my PhD. Um, and I found that it's very easy to talk about these things, about Advaita, and almost impossible to practice it, especially when it counts. You know, when you're interacting with someone, maybe you get in some kind of verbal argument and you lose your temper. Where's your Advaita then? you know? And there's so many examples like this that were coming up again and again. And I was like, you know what? I feel like I'm deceiving myself. And so I gradually evolved toward a different philosophy, and that could be a subject of a different session, or if you have questions, we can talk about it later. But in any case, I eventually moved not like away exactly, but I ended up embracing a spiritual philosophy that's broader than just Shankara's non-dual philosophy. It accepts Shankara, but then it also accepts bhakti, and it accepts, the personal God and so on. And it gives scope to the other yogas as well. So it doesn't just exclusively emphasize the path of knowledge. So if you have questions, we can talk about that. But so let me first talk about, very briefly summarize what are the main doctrines of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, okay? Because it's crucial to understanding the Advaitic practice of the path of knowledge. Okay, number one, what is the nature of ultimate reality? Shankara says it's non-dual, attributeless, pure consciousness. Okay? And it's our true nature. So the famous Sanskrit formula is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahmaivana Paraha. Non-dual, pure consciousness alone is real. Jagat is mithya. This world is an illusion. It's not ultimately real. It feels real, it seems real, but that's because we're ignorant of our true nature as Brahman, as pure consciousness. When we realize what our true nature is, we'll find that this whole world is nothing more than a dream, a kind of illusion, a protracted illusion, like an illusory snake superimposed upon the real rope. Okay. And then the last part of the Sanskrit formula is Jivo Brahmaivana Paraha. And each of us is identical with that pure consciousness, which is the sole truth or the sole reality. So that is Advaita Vedanta in a nutshell. Now, in terms of spiritual practices, Shankara says one type of spiritual practice is superior to all the others, and it is a path of knowledge. That's our focus for today, right? So we'll talk in a second about what the path of knowledge is. We can just briefly mention it now. It consists of three main practices. We don't have a marker, right? Yeah, okay. So Shravana. Do you disposable, like a, what do you call it? Erasable one? Yeah. Cool. Okay. Oh, great. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. So three main practices. We got one is Shravana. Two is Manana. Three is Nididhyasana. Okay. So Shravana means hearing. Hearing what? A qualified Advaita Guru tells you one of the Mahavakyas, they're called, one of the great teachings from the Upanishads. There are four, according to Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. Okay, so one of them, the one in our tradition, for instance, is Aham Brahmasmi. I am that Brahman. And Brahman here is understood in Shankara's sense as non-dual pure consciousness. So I am pure consciousness. You hear that Mahavakya from a qualified guru. Next step is you reflect intellectually on that teaching. And what does it mean to reflect? Remove doubts about it and gain clarity about it, gain conviction about it. Well, how can I be pure consciousness? Right, like I feel pain when the body is, malnourished or when it's diseased. And so how do you respond to that? And then so on. And what about other philosophical schools like Buddhism, which denies that there's an eternal self? Right. So how do you respond to that? So that's at the manana stage, where you remove doubts, where you strengthen your conviction in the truth of this Mahavakya that you heard in the first stage. Okay. But even that's not the final practice. The third practice is Nididhyasana. And this is actually the most difficult of the three to define and explain, partly because even within Shankara's school, there are somewhat divergent ways of understanding what Nididhyasana is. So some will say it's like meditation on the truth of your true nature as pure consciousness. Other people will say it's something more like kind of an internalization or an assimilation or a kind of practicalization of this saying, of this truth that we are each in our true nature, pure consciousness. What do I mean? Making it practical. It means like live it, try to live it. That's one way of thinking about it. Another one is meditate deeply on the fact that you are pure consciousness. Okay. And there, in fact, there's some Advaitic texts like Panchadashi, which talk about nirguna dhyana. Nirguna means without attributes. It means meditate on your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness. You can think of like some kind of effulgent light in the heart, between the eyebrows, something like that. And you imagine, it's obviously an imagination, but at the same time, it's a kind of non-dual meditation because you're imagining that you are that effulgent light within, that pure consciousness. Okay. Okay, so these are the three main practices of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. I can mention very briefly that after Shankara, different sub-schools emerged. Okay. And the two main ones are called Bhamati and Vivarana. Okay. And there's some subtle differences between these two sub-schools. They accept the basic metaphysics of Advaita Vedanta, but there are some differences. And one of them has to do with these three practices. Okay. So the Bhamati school says you have to practice these in sequence. Okay. So one is followed by two, is followed by three, and then you get moksha. You get liberation and freedom from all suffering. Vivarana says no. And in fact, the thing that generates moksha directly is one. Just the hearing. This is actually called, there's a name for this, Shabda Aparokshawada. Aparoksha means like immediacy. So immediately upon hearing, if you are a qualified aspirant, you will get liberation. Okay. So their idea is not that these things are not important, steps 2 and 3, but go ahead and do these constantly as much as you can. That's a way of purifying the mind and gaining conviction. And then ultimately what generates the moksha is going to be the Shravana. When the mind becomes sufficiently pure and receptive, then it's actually the Shravana which generates the moksha. Whereas in Bhamati, it's really step 3. It's this deep meditation, resulting in basically nirvikalpa samadhi. This the highest kind of state of, I don't know if trance is the best term, but where you lose external consciousness and you merge in non-dual Brahman. Okay. Okay. So this is Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. Now, I deliberately put off reading one of the verses from Ashtavakra toward the very beginning. The second verse of Ashtavakra says the following. It's the very first thing Ashtavakra says, actually. Muktim ichhasi chet tata vishayan vishaya. Oh, vishavat. Yeah, it's the Sanskrit here is smudged. Okay. Vishayan vishavatyaja. Kshamajavadayatosha satyam piyushavad bhaja. Okay. So what does this mean? It's a beautiful verse, actually. Muktimichasiti chetata. If you aspire after liberation, if you seek liberation, my child, tata. Vishayan vishavat tyaja. Vishavat tyaja. You should renounce sense objects as if they are poison. Vishavat. Okay. Kshamajava dayatosha. And then he says, you should strive to cultivate forgiveness. So all these ethical qualities, forgiveness, uprightness and sincerity, integrity, daya, compassion, kindness, tosha, contentment, and satyam, truthfulness. And you should cultivate these as nectar, treat them as nectar, and try to cultivate them to the best of your ability. So what's he saying here? It's his very first teaching. before he gets into the flights, the highest flights of Advaita and all that. He says you need these ethical prerequisites. And that's absolutely crucial. Shankara was very insistent on that. So if you want to study Advaita Vedanta properly, you have to read Shankara's commentaries. Okay. And he wrote commentaries on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and the Brahma Sutra. Okay. And I think that to get the most accurate picture of Shankara's views, it's best to read his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, especially. And there are reasons for that. Have any of you studied the Brahma Sutra or any parts of it? Do you know anything about it? There are these extremely compressed sutras, which means these tiny little expressions in Sanskrit, which are so terse that they're missing essential information. They often don't have grammatical subjects. They don't have verbs. One of the sutras is literally just the letter cha, and it just means and. And then you have to fill in the gaps and figure out what the heck. But what that means is, from the standpoint of interpretation, is that gives commentators a lot of latitude in being creative with their interpretations. And so they have the most latitude, arguably, with that scripture in kind of presenting and developing their own views. Do you see what I mean? Whereas, by contrast, something like the Bhagavad Gita, the commentators are, at least to a certain extent, constrained by what the scripture is actually saying, and you have to account for it. Whereas with this Brahma Sutra, it's like there's so little text there that you can kind of like push it in whatever direction you want. Okay, that's part of the reason why Shankara's commentary on the Brahma Sutra is considered to be the most authoritative in understanding his views. But anyway, I mention that only because his commentary on the very first sutra of the Brahma Sutra, 1.1.1, Atato Brahma Jigyasa, which means, and now begins our inquiry into Brahman. Shankara has a long commentary where he says that now, for whom? Can anyone pick up the book and start practicing Advaita Vedanta and studying Advaita Vedanta? He says no. Emphatically, he says no. There are very stringent eligibility requirements. You're sitting here today because you applied to UCLA and you fulfilled all the requirements and you had a high GPA and you this SAT or whatever, right? There are eligibility requirements, and then you might get in. So Shankara says there are very strict and high eligibility requirements for even being eligible to study Advaita Vedanta, let alone practice it in any serious way. Okay. And he says that specifically that the eligibility requirements are being perfectly equipped with what's called sadhana. I guess it is. Yeah, it's more or less okay. It captures the whole word, so it looks like it. Yeah. Sadhana chatushtaya. Okay. This means the fourfold sadhana, the fourfold spiritual practice. What are the four? The first is viveka. Second is vairagya. Third is shat sampat. Fourth is mumukshutva. Okay, viveka means discrimination, not in a bad sense. If you don't like the word, you can use the term discernment. But the idea is to discriminate between what's real and unreal. Okay? Vairagya, intense detachment toward everything in the world. You should have no emotional attachments. You should have no desires for anything in the world. Okay? Shat Sampat, the six spiritual treasures. What are these? Maybe I should. Now we're going to go. Is this going to be captured? How about we do this? Okay, there we go. Okay. The six treasures are Dhamma, Dhamma, Uparati, Titiksha, Shraddha and Samadhana. Okay, I'll just mention them briefly and then focus on a couple of them. First one is Shama. This is the first of the six spiritual treasures. It means perfect control over the mind.
Is this the same Shama that appears in 6.1 Gita?
6.1 Gita, 6.2. Anashita karma phalam. Oh, you mean the three, Arurukshod Munedi Yogam, 6.3 in the Gita. Arurukshod Munedi Yogam karma karan uchyate. Yoga arursta seva shamaha karan uchyate. It's well, that's a good question, but it depends. I don't know if you caught the last class that I teach a class on Bhagavad Gita at the Hollywood Center, which he follows. But different commentators have different interpretations of the term shama there. It's related at least because it means things like tranquility, calmness. And if you have perfect control over the mind, it means your mind won't be restless, you won't have unwanted thoughts, which means what? You're calm, you're tranquil. So there's a definite relation. Now, what exactly in this context, it means perfect control over the mind. The mind is not unruly. The Kathopanishad has a famous metaphor to explain this. Imagine a chariot and that there are reins connected to horses, right? And it's the horses that move the chariot, obviously. And there's the charioteer who controls the reins. And then there's the rider in the chariot, the person who's got a place to go and is paying the charioteer and blah, blah, blah. So what is this an elaborate metaphor for? The chariot represents the physical body that each of us inhabits. Okay. Um, the charioteer, buddhi, the higher intellect that is able to exercise viveka if it's guided properly. The rider in the chariot is the soul, the Atman. Okay. And the reins that the buddhi, the charioteer, is holding is what? The mind. And then the horses represent the senses and the paths on which the horses travel, the sense objects. So the idea is, the Upanishad explains this in detail, if the buddhi has firm control over the reins, it can properly guide the horses in the form of the sense organs and lead the soul in the direction of liberation. You can discipline the horses in the sense organs, right? And the opposite is also true. If you let go of the reins, if you're not disciplined, then what happens ultimately? The horses become unruly and they go all over the place, right? And the same is true of the mind. An unruly mind is one in which thoughts occur without you willing them to be there, right? And often thoughts that are unwanted. And so a test is not necessarily that unwholesome thoughts never arise, but when they do arise, are you affected by them? And to what extent are you affected? How do you react? Do you immediately identify with those thoughts? Like a thought of anger. Do you immediately identify with that wave of anger, or can you take a step back? So that's a good test of Shama. Okay, so that's just Shama. Perfect control of mind. That's already, you can see how high level these requirements are, right? Who has perfect control over the mind? Second, perfect control of the senses. Okay, over the sense organs. And in the Gita chapter 2, Krishna gives a good metaphor, a nice metaphor to kind of explain what perfect control of the senses is. Yada samharate chayam kurmongani vasarvashaha indriyan indriyartheshu sthita prajnastadochyate, I think. Yeah. So, but the basic idea is just as a tortoise withdraws its limbs the moment it senses some kind of predator around it, that it's going to be attacked. It pulls in its limbs into its shell, right? And at no cost will it bring out its limbs again until the danger has passed. Likewise, the realized soul is the one who withdraws his or her sense organs from sense objects, feels absolutely no attachment or aversion toward any sense objects. Okay, so that's an example of perfect Dhamma. Okay, and you might also ask, like, is there a logic in the sequence of these six treasures? Should Shama be considered to be the basis of the remaining ones? In one sense, you can argue that Shama there's a reason why it's number one on the list, and it's because you can't really have perfect control over the senses. You can't have any of these other qualities unless you have some control over the mind. Okay. But I think it's better to think of them not necessarily as strictly sequential, but as kind of mutually reinforcing and as complementary. The better you get in one of them, the more likely it is you'll be better at the others too. You're in a better position to cultivate the other five. Okay. Okay. So that's Shama, Dama. Uparati, the third one. This means like a spontaneous and very kind of natural withdrawal of the senses from sense objects. So it's like the culmination or perfection of two or one and two combined. You don't need to try anymore. You don't have to make an effort to control the mind or control the senses. It's just, automatic. Um, there's an example in the life of Sri Ramakrishna, slightly off color, but I'll mention it anyway. When his rich patron, Motul Babu, started getting worried about Ramakrishna because Ramakrishna was so God intoxicated that he wasn't focused on anything in the world. He's behaving a little crazy. And so Motu Babu came up with an idea. So he brought him to a place and he said, go into this room. And he goes in the room and he sees this beautiful prostitute. And immediately he sees her as Divine Mother. Like it's not even like he struggled. Like there was no struggle. It was just, he fell to the floor, started weeping and prayed to Divine Mother. And then she became embarrassed. And then so there's a whole scene. But that's like an example of uparati, which means it's not even a spiritual practice at that point. It's just, he can only see the divine in everyone, and it's very spontaneous. Okay, so that's the third of the six. Fourth, titiksha. This means forbearance, um, endurance. Like all of us, any mature adult, you guys are already adults, but the more you live, the more you'll realize this is true, is that you will not always have things going your way. There will always be times when you have to like accept less than optimal circumstances. Um, Roommates are a good example, especially in college when you have roommates and housemates who may not be ideal and you'll get into conflicts and whatever. And so but if you can treat all of these kinds of, we can say, adverse circumstances as opportunities for spiritual practice, then your whole attitude toward all these apparently negative things, circumstances, or experiences, it undergoes a kind of transformation. Okay. And one of these great Advaitic texts is called Viveka Chudamani. Some of you might have heard of it. So there's a great definition of titiksha, the fourth of the six treasures there. Do any of you know it? Sahanam sarva dukkhanam apratikara purvakam chinta vilaparahitam sa titiksha nigaddate. What is titiksha? What is forbearance? It gives a very precise definition, which I think is extremely practical too. Sahanam sarva dukkhanam. You should be able to just bear with all negative experiences and circumstances. Okay. And what else? Apratikara purvakam. There should be no reactivity, no emotional reactivity. This is a really good test. You might say, like, yeah, okay, my roommate is really irritating and isn't holding up his or her end of the bargain, and I have to clean the bathroom even though it's her day to do it, and blah blah blah, all these things. You can say all that without emotion, without reactivity. And then that would be a case. See, that doesn't mean you should be lazy and complacent and just let your roommate treat you like a doormat, right? That's not titiksha. Do what needs to be done, but minus the reactivity. The problem from a spiritual standpoint is the attitude. If you're reactive, if you're getting angry about your bad roommate, if you're feeling resentment toward your roommate, these are examples of emotional reactivity, right? But as I said, that doesn't mean let your roommate run roughshod over you. Do what needs to be done without the reactivity. Okay? Yeah.
I think that shloka from the Gita, Master Sparsha, that has the word titiksha, right?
Titikshasva. Yeah, tam titikshasva bharata.
Is that
Exactly the same thing, but in the form of a verb. Because titikshasva means you should try to forbear, you should endure all these things. He's referring to a verse in the Gita, chapter 2, I think, where it's endure heat and cold, happiness and pleasure as equal. Like, don't be bothered by them. Don't react to any of these different kinds of circumstances. Okay. Maintain equanimity in the midst of all of these different circumstances, these fluctuations.
Sorry, is that think about
Yeah, that's why I was saying that all six of these are kind of mutually reinforcing, and you can't be perfect in one without achieving substantial progress in the others. You know what I mean? So I think that's right. The logic, like, unless you're very detached, it's hard to see how you can be you can practice perfect forbearance, and even vice versa. But practicing greater and greater forbearance will help you to develop more vairagya as well, detachment toward things. Yeah. Yeah, no, no, you don't do apologize. Yeah, that's the purpose of this. Yeah. Mm. Yeah.
I understand in the context of anger because that usually leads to like hurting of other people.
Yeah.
But if you
And a loss of mental calm, right? Because that's the worst thing. Yeah.
I was wondering with that reactivity, what is the sort of like motivation behind certain like actions?
Yeah, right.
Like how do you like say like in a positive context? Sometimes like things like stress, for example, can motivate you to behave in a certain way.
Right.
With a certain level of like dispassion and like I guess non-reactivity, how do you still maintain a certain level of commitment and dedication?
Right. And kind of motivation, right? Is that, yeah, yeah. That's a great question. It's one that's often raised in the context of the Bhagavad Gita's teachings on karma yoga. Because karma, so we talked about this in one of the previous sessions, but karma yoga is the path of selfless action, right? And again, Krishna is telling us, so do whatever is your duty, like in your case, your students, and so you study to the best of your ability. But then you're going to ask, well, and then Krishna says, but if you're a karma yogi, you shouldn't be attached to the outcome, to the fruits of your actions. And then the question inevitably becomes, well, if I'm not attached to the outcome, then what exactly is my motivation for doing well and for doing the work at all? And then Krishna's answer is, do it as an offering to the divine and do it as a service to the divine. Whatever you do. And then I like using this example because I think it's helpful. Think about a mother cooking for her young child. What does she get out of it? She's going to cook to the best of her ability. She's probably going to put in more energy and love into it because she's cooking for a child than if she were just cooking for herself. If you're just cooking for yourself, I'll throw something up, I'll microwave some oatmeal and eat it. But for my kid, no, I'm going to make pancakes and then this and that. What are you getting out of it? Nothing selfish, but just to please your child and to make him or her happy. So, in the same way, if you can think of God in that way and think of all of your actions as an offering to God, obviously you're going to do your best. When we do puja, and Hindus, of course, we do puja. We often do a bhoga, right? We have a food offering. Do you offer the fruits that were pecked at by crows and that have insects and the stuff that you want to get rid of that you wouldn't eat yourself? No, you offer the best. You go to Whole Foods and you spend 5 times as much to get the same kind of products as you get at Trader Joe's. But why? Because it's going to be given to God. It'll be an offering to God. So likewise, you should have that attitude. The motivation is to serve God. Okay. That's from the standpoint of bhakti. It gets more complicated when with Advaita Vedanta, because at the highest levels, there is no God in that sense, at least on one mainstream interpretation of Advaita Vedanta. Okay. But does that more or less answer the question or?
No, that doesn't.
Okay, great. Okay, great. Good. Okay, so now back to I just want to finish explaining this Vivekachudamani verse, which defines titiksha, endurance, forbearance. So you should be able to forbear in the midst of all negative circumstances and experiences. And the three main tests are of that you're genuinely exercising, practicing titiksha is number one, there should be no emotional reactivity. Apratikara purvakam. Chinta vilaparahitam is the other thing. You should be devoid of two things. Number one is chinta. This is very interesting. Chinta. You shouldn't keep thinking about, if you're thinking about it, it means there's some problem. You're obsessing. You got grinding your teeth. You start thinking about why did, that's another test. If your mind keeps going back to it, there's a problem. And probably it's linked to this emotional reactivity. Unless you have the reactivity, you're not going to be thinking about it, right? And then third, vilapa. Vilapa rahitam. No complaints. This is also another test. If you're complaining constantly, either internally, mentally, with that voice in your head, or you're complaining to other people, again, that's not perfect forbearance. Now, that doesn't mean like be a goody goody and just keep your mouth shut. Because then what happens is you're repressing all the emotions. That's not healthy. The idea is this is like a definition of perfect titiksha, right? And on the way to perfect titiksha, you may have to like restrain yourself from punching your roommate in the face. That's a good first step because you're refraining from physical violence. And then the next step is, okay, let me try to remove the anger and the irritation and the from my emotional state and my mental state. So there are baby steps along the way toward this perfect forbearance. Okay. All right. So this is Titiksha. We're still on just the fourth of the six treasures, which is the third of the fourfold sadhana. Okay. Just to be able to study Advaita Vedanta, this is what we need to do. And then we got two more. Shraddha. Shraddha means, it's a very hard term to translate into English or any other language. Typically, it's translated as faith. I think that's one of the connotations, but I think it has other connotations as well, like conviction, deep conviction, willingness and ability to put what you've learned at the level of theory into practice. These kinds of things are all kind of, I think, also implied or connoted by the term. Here, I think that, there's a really interesting question that arises. When I first studied Shankara, as I said, it was really Shankara who got me away from agnosticism to accept some reality beyond the senses, right? I believed in pure consciousness. And at the time, I thought, one of the things that I liked about Shankara is that, well, it's not based on blind faith. You don't need to believe in anything. You just have to follow that thread of the eye, and then just ask yourself, who am I? What is the nature of the eye? But now, after having read Shankara more carefully, what I've realized is that Shankara is pretty emphatic that you need to have faith in a couple things at least in order to practice Advaita Vedanta properly. Number one is faith in the scriptures, in the Vedanta scriptures, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, the Brahma Sutra themselves. Why faith? Why? Because the scriptures are not purely logical reasoning. The scriptures tell us about things that you can't arrive at through logical reasoning. And in fact, Shankara himself, in certain sutras, in the Brahma Sutras, some of them is like one of the sutras is Tarka Apratishtanadva, which means there is no conclusiveness to reasoning. And Shankara gives a great example. He says, you, through intellectual reasoning, have completely convinced yourself of the truth of your standpoint. And he says, the problem is that's always precarious. Because the next moment, what might happen? A guy with who's an even more brilliant mind than yours comes up and just chops your argument to pieces. And it'll keep going on like that. There'll be the super Einstein to defeat Einstein, and then there's a super Einstein. So there's no conclusiveness to intellectual reasoning. The scriptures are talking about spiritual experiences and truths based on spiritual experience. But again, until we have those spiritual experiences, we have to have faith in what those great Upanishadic rishis are telling us, what the scriptures are telling us. That's a kind of faith. Faith means what? Believing in something before you actually have direct proof or knowledge of it, right? So you have to have faith in the scriptures. You also need to have faith in the guru, that what the guru is telling you is true, that the guru himself is capable of giving you this, imparting this knowledge to you. You need to have faith in the guru. And so long as you have not attained the highest truth, you should also have faith in God. Although I don't think Shankara emphasizes that so much necessarily. Sometimes he does. But that's also important from the empirical standpoint, at least, like from the standpoint of spiritual practice. Okay. So I think that there's a faith element. I think it's a caricature to contrast Advaita Vedanta with devotional traditions, bhakti schools, and to say that, see, Advaita is completely rational and you don't have to believe in anything. Whereas these bhakti traditions, they're based on blind faith. And they ask you to swallow a bunch of things and you end up looking down on bhakti as a result. Yeah.
I just want to clarify, so there is a theistic element then? Like the Shraddha to God, is that essential, at least in Shankara?
I wouldn't necessarily say it's essential. Like Totapuri, Sri Ramakrishna's Advaita Guru didn't seem to have faith in God before he came to Sri Ramakrishna, but he attained the highest. So I don't think that's essential, but faith in scriptures and guru are essential according to Shankara. Okay. Now, another thing I wanted to mention, also in his commentary on the first sutra of the Brahma Sutra, 1.1.1, Shankara talks about this faith issue. And he explicitly says that you need to have faith. in the path of Advaita. And it's a very interesting discussion. He says the following. He kind of like channels Ramana Maharshi here. If some of you are familiar with Ramana Maharshi, you know. Okay, what does Ramana say again and again? He says, the sole spiritual practice is this inquiry, who am I? That's it. Goham, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? And you just follow that thread of the I to its source, which is pure consciousness. And that's it. That's all you need. Now, what Shankara says, yeah, that's true in a sense, but so he says, no rational person can coherently deny his or her own existence. I can't deny that I exist because the very act of denying my existence affirms my existence. Right? Only somebody who exists can deny that he exists. Okay, right? Okay, I think that's uncontroversial. Then he says, but there's plenty of debate and controversy possible about the true nature of this I. And he gives examples. He says the Charvaka materialists say that the I is nothing but the physical body, and that consciousness is a product of the brain, and that when the body dies, consciousness goes with it. So it doesn't, the Charvaka materialism doesn't believe in an afterlife. So it's very scientific, materialistic, like contemporary science. I bet CogSci might also, because I know neuroscience does. I don't know how materialistic CogSci is. What's your take on that? Like, do they give you, like, are there certain like presuppositions in the discipline of cognitive science, like that consciousness is a product of the brain?
I mean, this is one of the biggest questions.
Oh, but it's an open question.
It's
oh, good. That's good to know.
Neuroscience like goes from the very brain perspective.
That's what I mean. So the neuroscience is not an open question. It's a closed. It's a closed question. I see.
David Chalmers.
Yeah.
Like philosophy.
Yeah.
And everything. So it's
good. Okay, so they're more open. I'm already liking CogSci more than neuroscience and other stuff. Okay, good. So, and then Shankara also mentions Buddhism, and he says Buddhists deny that there's any kind of enduring self, any kind of permanent or eternal Atman. So you can, even if you can't deny the existence of the I, there can be plenty of different views on what is the nature of that I. So you have to, Shankara then says, so therefore you have to have faith in what the Upanishads tell us about the true nature of the I. The Upanishads tell us that in our deepest essence, that I is nothing but non-dual pure consciousness, according to Shankara's interpretation. Okay? But see how so I remember having debates with Sarvapriyanji about this back in, he was one of my, I was fortunate enough to have had him as one of my acharyas, teachers in training center in Bilumat. Every monk has to go through a 2-year training center. So I was having debates with him privately after class and whatever, because he would often teach Advaita Vedanta as being completely rational and not based on any kind of faith or belief. And I would always say, that's not what Shankara is saying. Shankara says you have to have faith in the Upanishads. And we'd have these debates, and they're kind of unresolved. But anyway, I want to mention that because think about it for yourself. But when I read Shankara, I find that he does insist on the need for belief. You don't have to believe in a personal God, but you need to believe in something. You need to believe in what the scriptures tell us about the nature of the Atman. You have to believe in your guru as well. Have faith in your guru.
Just a comment, I think at a practical level, I mean, like I know that some people try to say that you can treat it as a hypothesis. But I think as a practical level, most of us are not going to reach a conclusion about the hypothesis.
No, I actually am not of the view that you should think about these scriptures and what your guru tells you as a hypothesis, because it's too non-committal in a way.
But it depends on what Swami Sarvapriyananda might have been saying. In principle, at least some of Vivekananda's teaching on Raja Yoga, especially, I think, come across as like treated as a hypothesis, working hypothesis. But I think the problem is that in an experiment, a good experiment should have a resolution at some point. Whereas for most of us, we're not going to attain
in this life, maybe.
Yeah.
Although don't get too depressed. Yeah.
So then we can't. At some point you have to have faith. Otherwise, how are you going to continue? Yeah,
and then I also feel like just calling it a hypothesis is probably just not strong enough as a commitment. It needs to be a wholehearted existential conviction and commitment. And I think hypothesis is just too abstract and dry and kind of, you know what I mean? It's more than that. Burning faith. That's something that Ramakrishna would often emphasize, right? And in science, they'll say that that's a bias and so I don't think it's a perfect analogy, actually, I would say. Okay. So anyway, that's a little digression on Shraddha, faith. And now finally, the sixth treasure is Samadhana, which means perfect one-pointedness. Whatever you devote yourself to, in the context of Jnana Yoga, what are you trying to devote yourself to? Concentration on the Mahavakya. To the exclusion of everything else. One-pointed focus on your nature as non-dual pure consciousness. Okay? Those are the six treasures. Now we get to the fourth element of the sadhana chatushtaya, the fourfold sadhana. It's mumukshutva, intense longing for liberation. Even if you have everything else, how many people, Sri Ramakrishna will say, he says, well, because he's often asked by people, how do we realize God? And he says, people shed jugfuls of tears for their children, for their spouse, for their loved ones, for their country, for their pet. When the pet dies, how many people cry? Of course, most of them do. Who cries for God? Who sheds tears for God? Who cries in longing for God? So that's that fourth criterion. He gives another example. A disciple asks, I think it was Christ actually in the example he gives. A disciple of Christ goes to Christ and says, you keep talking about longing for God. What is longing for God? He says, come with me. And then takes him to a body of water. Forcibly dunks his head underwater for a long time. And the disciple starts starts panicking, tries to get up, and he can't. And he holds it down. And then finally, when that guy's just almost about to drown, he pulls him back up. And then Christ asks him, so what did it feel like? I was panting, I was dying for breath. He said, now you know what it's like to long for God. So that's mumukshutva. How many of us can honestly say that we have perfectly attained all four of these things? I don't think anybody can really raise their hand here. I certainly can, right? And what Shankara says is, until you have attained perfect mastery in these four elements of the Sadhana Chatushtaya, you are not eligible to even study Advaita Vedanta. You are not. Okay, and well, then you might ask, well, then what should we do? And then he says two things mainly, Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga. Like Arjuna. Basically, Shankara's entire interpretation of the Gita is Arjuna was an inferior spiritual aspirant. He was a Kshatriya who's not a Brahmin, first of all. That's a big negative for Shankara. Okay, and he needs to fight in a war. That's his duty on the side of justice. He's fighting for justice. Okay, and Krishna's trying to convince him to fight. Arjuna doesn't want to. And Shankara's whole thing is, well, yeah, he's not eligible to practice the path of knowledge because his mind isn't sufficiently pure. And so he's only eligible to practice Karma Yoga. That's the idea, right? So for the rest of us, those who do not have these qualifications, Shankara says, stick with Karma Yoga, stick with Bhakti Yoga. Now you might ask, well, why can't we combine Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga with Jnana Yoga? Wonderful. Swami Vivekananda recommends that. Why? Shankara gives a reason. He says, look, the problem is the path of knowledge is all about realizing your non-dual nature as pure consciousness. In Karma Yoga, what happens is you feel like you're the doer, right? And I'm engaging in actions and I'm interacting with other people. All of that is in the realm of duality. So if you're practicing Karma Yoga and Jnana Yoga at the same time, you're working at cross purposes. By practicing Jnana Yoga, you're trying to realize your non-dual nature. When you're practicing Karma Yoga, you're reinforcing duality. And so it's like you're trying to move your boat and you're using your oar to paddle, but the anchor is still stuck on the ground, which means the boat's not going to go anywhere. You're going nowhere fast. Same thing with bhakti. Practicing any kind of devotion, love, service toward God. What's the problem? Reinforces duality. God is separate from me. I'm his bhakta. He is upasya, that thing to be worshipped, that supreme being who is to be worshipped. Which means that's reinforcing my difference from God, which means it's reinforcing duality, and that's not going to help me attain non-duality, except indirectly. So then Shankara says, but all that said, Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga have an essential function as preparatory disciplines, preparatory spiritual practices. Karma Yoga helps with purifying the mind. And Bhakti Yoga helps with purifying the mind and also concentrating the mind, making it one-pointed. It's one-pointed on God when you practice bhakti yoga. Then what happens is once you become sufficiently pure in mind and sufficiently one-pointed, you become eligible, you get better at all these fourfold sadhanas. Then you become eligible to practice the path of knowledge. And then doing these things will actually be fruitful. You see the idea? Okay. Why do I say all this? Well, partly because these days, Advaita is all the rage. And it's glamorous. And it's almost like a kind of like a spiritual shortcut, or it feels like that, or it seems like that, the way it's advertised these days. And it's called Neo-Advaita. Neo-Advaita. It's Advaita, but it's Neo, somehow new. What's new about it? Let's drop all this pesky fourfold sadhana. Who needs it? Because that's also in the realm of duality and Maya. So by worrying too much about that stuff, then that's also going to reinforce duality, right? And so let's just jump straight to the other Ashtavakra, the juicy stuff from Ashtavakra Samhita. You are not the body, you are not the mind. I am pure consciousness. I was never bound. And that's it. It makes it seem, Neo-Advaitins make it seem as if all you have to do is just mentally tell yourself, or these days, get a YouTube channel and teach the world that we are pure consciousness, and that's it. You've heard the story, I'm sure, because I mentioned it a lot in my classes. But when I was, just before I became a monk, I did a 6-month pilgrimage in India. And one of the places I visited was Kodaikanal. You know the story, right? Yeah. And I walk into a bakery. This is in Tamil Nadu. And the lady working there looked at me. I was wearing white, this kind of clothes, but white. And she asked what I was going to do. I said, I'm going to join the Ramakrishna mission. It's a 9-10 year process to become a sannyasi. And blah, blah, blah. There's a whole training period. And she goes, oh, why go to all that trouble? I'm a follower of Ramana Maharshi. And what he used to say is just dive into the Atman. So why don't you just dive into the Atman? So this is a classic Neo-Advaita, right? And the danger is you're very likely to end up in self-deception. And Ramakrishna would often say, if you do that, if you try to practice Advaita without the requisite qualifications, you end up deceiving yourself and deceiving others. Both. You deceive yourself because you're in this kind of state of delusion, like there's something very uplifting and, as I said, sublime and inspiring about these teachings, right? And so in that emotional intoxication, just by reading some of these verses, you might even feel, that's it, I'm liberated. There are literal cases of this. I've seen some in my own monastic order of people who, just by reading Nisargadatta Maharaj's a few pages of his teachings or Ramana Maharshi or something, they think they've got it, you know? But they haven't. The vast majority of the time. There are some exceptional cases. I'm not saying that it's not possible, but it's rare, very, very rare. Okay. And so Neo-Advaita, this is one of the great dangers. So that's how you deceive yourself. It's a kind of intellectual understanding. It's a certain emotional intoxication, which you mistake for the highest realization. Okay. Number 2, deceiving others. Because if you can talk well, if you're very eloquent, very powerful, charismatic, ideally you grow a beard, all the trappings of a traditional yogi, then what happens? People can easily fall under the impression that you are a realized soul, even if you're not. Right? And these days, it's kind of like, some of you seen the show Silicon Valley? Nobody's seen Silicon Valley? The HBO show about, okay, anyway, but you did, right? But there's the parody of the Indian guru for, yeah. Oh, what's his name?
Elizabeth.
Yeah, no, but I'm talking about, I think she's the lady actress, but there's some huge company, and there's an Indian guru who's kind of like the guru to the CEO, and it's like the send up of this this kind of like the long hair hippie kind of, and all he really cares about is money. But he's like using all sorts of fancy spiritual language and terminology and lingo and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, it's anybody and their mother can now be a guru with YouTube now. You know what I mean? I'm guessing, yeah. We don't need to speculate about the names right now, but Right. So that's how you can easily deceive others as well, right? And of course, there are many cases of scandals with like these big gurus who then turn out to be scoundrels or frauds or whatever. Okay, so I think it's real. And then there's another danger in Neo-Advaita, which is what? Ego. Because a lot of these Neo-Advaitans, especially the unripe ones who haven't really made much progress on the ethical front and on the spiritual front, what happens? They start priding themselves on the fact that they're special. And they start looking down on those who believe in God. Oh, that's good. You guys believe in God. That's nice. That's good for you. Maybe someday you'll come up to my level. Maybe in a few lifetimes. It's very common. I've seen this a lot. They look down on bhaktas. And so, ironically, what happens is that this spiritual practice can become a source of ego. And it actually makes you more selfish, more egoistic. Okay, so these are just dangers along the way. It's very important to keep these things in mind. Yes.
Question.
Yes.
So firstly, the Shravana, maybe a technical question.
Yeah.
Suppose you've heard it from an unqualified teacher or something.
Right.
And would Shankara say, or the Dhamati schools say that, or the Vivarana schools say that if there's still a utility to hearing it from someone who is a qualified teacher?
I think maybe they'll say that, like, if you're like the absolute optimal ideal spiritual aspirant, you don't even need to hear it from a guru at all. Like Ramana Maharshi didn't hear it from a guru, right? He imagined that he died, right? And then he just lay on the floor like a corpse. And then he had this spontaneous enlightenment almost, right? Where he realized he wasn't the body, and then he realized that he was non-dual preconscious. But then a traditional Shankarite will probably say, yeah, but that's because he was taught Advaita by a qualified guru in his past life. And he did a lot of spiritual practices and austerities in a past life. You can always come up with explanations in that way. So, yeah. Okay. So did I answer your question?
No. So
no.
Was Shankara's view, I mean, back in the day, one could imagine that most people would not have had access to all of these scriptures. And so maybe a guru was the only source of some of this.
Well, it was certainly like verbally transmitted. Those teachings were not, I think not much was written probably.
So is the idea exposure, or is the idea the teacher? Like, which is
I think also the teacher should be realized. That's what a qualified guru means. Okay. It's not just about scriptural knowledge, but actually they need to be Brahmagyanis in order to impart Brahmagyana. Right? Takes one to know one kind of thing.
And then the second question related is, don't even try. Does that mean don't explore it as an intellectual thing, or don't try to practice it? Like,
But the interesting thing is, if you're really strict about the path of knowledge, there's no distinction between an intellectual understanding of Advaita and the path of knowledge. The whole practice is more or less intellectual as far as I can tell. What else is it besides intellect? It's just easy intellectual understanding. It's nothing other than that. It's just that with a very pure mind, there's a spontaneous enlightenment.
Well, I think that maybe number 2 is definitely intellectual, but then the number 3 could be...
And it depends on the school. I said, so this Bhamati school kind of puts more of a stress on number 3, Nididhyasana, and then emphasizes more meditation, culminating in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, which is a kind of trance state. Whereas there are other Advaitins, like, have you heard of the modern Dayananda Saraswati, who left his body about a decade ago, Ashavidya Gurukula? So he was a Vivarana guy, and so very much downplayed Samadhi, didn't emphasize meditation much. And he just said, just intellectual understanding and knowledge of the scriptures is Advaitic practice. And if you have a sufficiently pure mind, you'll get realization. That's all you need. Okay. Okay, now I wanted to conclude on this note, because we're almost done here, and then we can discuss a little bit. This is not the only form of Jnana Yoga. There is another form. And it's taught by Ramanuja, who was a great bhakta. And he turned the tables on Shankara. He came a few centuries after Shankara and just did, and he did this. Shankara places Jnana Yoga above Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga. Ramanuja flips the tables, and then says, Bhakti Yoga is the highest discipline. Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga are preparatory disciplines leading into Bhakti Yoga. So let me try to explain to you Ramanuja's idea. Ramanuja was a bhakta. He believed in Vishnu. God is Vishnu. And realization of Vishnu is our liberation. Okay? Now, how do we attain this knowledge of Vishnu? At the early stages, what you should do is you should practice bhakti, but it's what Ramakrishna would call Vaidhi bhakti practices, which means your guru gives you a mantra, he tells you to do mantra japa, do your mantra japa, go to arati, attend satsangas, spiritual discourses, blah, all those things that we do, prayer, all those things, worship. Okay. That's Vaidhi bhakti. Karma yoga, do your duties, but do them as an offering to God. Right? What's the purpose of all this stuff? Purifying the mind. And at the same time, you should try to practice jnana yoga. So it's for most spiritual aspirants who are not eligible to practice this bhakti yoga proper, combine karma yoga with bhakti yoga with jnana yoga. And what does Ramanuja mean by jnana yoga here? Meditate on your true nature as an eternal soul, a jivatman, an individual soul, separate from the body-mind complex. Okay. That's what he means by jnana yoga. And it's perfectly coherent and compatible with karma yoga and bhakti yoga. See, you can do jnana yoga practice, and there's no problem of non-duality here. It's not about non-duality, right? But at the same time, arguably, it has some of the advantages of what we like about Shankara's path of knowledge. Because what I liked about it is, I loved, like in the Gita, and in like chapter 2 of the Gita, you are not the body, you are not the mind, you are the eternal Atman. All of that, Ramanuja can say, yes, I agree. And you should meditate on that. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't practice bhakti and you shouldn't practice karma yoga. Do all that, all together. And they're complementary and they reinforce each other. What should be the final outcome of all of these three combined practices? Atma avalokanam. Atma avalokanam. Ramanuja. Atma avalokanam. Okay. This term means realization, direct spiritual realization of yourself as the Atman. Here, Atman means the Jivatman, the individual soul, separate from the psychophysical complex. That's the idea. Once you have that realization, you are then eligible to practice bhakti yoga. You might think, well, what's so special about bhakti yoga? He defines bhakti yoga in a very stringent way. He says, bhakti yoga in its true sense is constant recollection of God and God alone. And you can just run a test right now on yourselves. 30 seconds, try to think of God, and you'll fail. Every single one of you will think about something else within a few seconds. Because we're not eligible to practice bhakti yoga proper. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to think of God. That's the Vaidhi bhakti practice that everybody should be doing. Think of God as much as you can. Ramakrishna would say, Sharbada Sharun Monan. Think of God as much as you can, pray to God, but you'll always fail. But that's the whole point. You fail, you fall on the ground, you pick yourself back up, you try again. Ultimately, what should happen is you realize yourself as an Atman. So the logic here, as Ramanuja says, is you can't feel this spontaneous, genuine love for God until you have broken your identification with the body-mind complex. And once you realize yourself as Jivatman, that Jivatman is an amsha of the divine. It's an eternal spark of the divine. So once you realize yourself as that soul, the soul has a kind of natural bhakti for God. So when you realize yourself as a soul, that bhakti will be able to manifest finally. And then you can practice bhakti yoga proper and think of God alone. And then you attain moksha. That's the idea. And so I would suggest that the safer, more effective, and more universally kind of applicable form of the path of knowledge would be Ramanuja's. That doesn't mean you have to accept the whole of Ramanuja's philosophy. That's not what I mean. In fact, I think it's sectarian in other ways, Ramanuja's philosophy, because he takes ultimate reality to be only Vishnu Narayana. And then he denies the reality of non-dual pure consciousness. Right. He just simply does not accept the reality of non-dual pure consciousness. Now, Ramakrishna, for instance, is somebody, so I in my academic work, I claim that his philosophy is what I call Vijnana Vedanta. And he fully accepts the reality of both non-dual pure consciousness and Shakti, the personal God. And he says, in fact, that Brahman and Shakti are non-different. They're the static and dynamic aspects of the same infinite divine reality, the same divine truth. And if you have that view, that very broad understanding of ultimate reality, what happens? You can practice any of the yogas to your heart's content and combine them at will as much as you want. You can learn from other spiritual traditions as well. You don't have to look down on other paths. And yeah, and so you can combine Jnana Yoga in Ramanuja's sense with Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga and Raja Yoga, the path of meditation. Does that make sense? All right. Any questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
When it comes to sort of like those identities that we sort of create for ourselves and we sort of associate ourselves like a student or like whatever, any of these identities, is the link between like you associating with that identity, ahankar? Is that how it works?
Yeah, at a certain level. These are called, Ramakrishna will call them upadhis. I just gave a talk on this called Who Do We Become? And throughout the day, basically we assume different identities, basically. You know, if you're a mother or a father or a spouse, what happens? You wake up in the morning, oh, my husband, that means I'm a wife. Oh, my children, that means I'm a mother or a father. I go to work, that means I'm an employee or a boss or there are a million things. You have hobbies, so you're a football player. So so you identify with different upadhis. Upadhi means a kind of some kind of label or identification. I'm a great intellectual, I'm a great pundit, I'm a great physicist, I'm a great this, I'm a great monk. That also can become an upadhi. Okay. Then what he says is, look, you can't avoid upadhis, but try to identify with the most sattvic upadhi possible. And he says the most sattvic, I'm using the term in the sense of sattva, the three gunas. The most sattvic upadhi possible is, I am a child of God, I am a servant of God. He calls it bhaktirami in Bengali. The eye of a devotee, the eye of a bhakta. Okay. So always try to maintain that eye of a devotee in the midst of all your actions, all your work, in all circumstances. If you can do that, that doesn't mean like, you're not a mother or you're not a student or you're not a friend. You know what I mean? But underlying all that is that fundamental upadhi, that sattvic upadhi of I am a child of God. So even when you're raising your kid, instead of kind of breathing down their neck and being a helicopter mom and thinking mine, and my kid has to grow up in this way and be a doctor because I'm a doctor and that kind of thing. You look upon your kid as it's almost like you're a custodian for that kid. You're looking after the kid to facilitate that kid's spiritual journey. But the kid's not yours because we're all just children of God. Right? So that kind of attitude.
This goes back to the concept of diksha, but I was just curious because you warned a bit about getting too caught up in like negative
reactivity. Emotional reactivity.
Emotional reactivity. And say you're like have this debate tomorrow, and you're just kind of being obsessive about it, and then you're getting caught in like this is like oh like this is you just kind of like get absorbed by it. How do you prevent that from becoming like a something that
consumes you or something? Yeah, I mean there are different techniques. One is prayer, especially if you are devotionally oriented. Prayer is very helpful. Anytime you catch yourself, you surrender to God and you say, I can't, right now my mind is obsessing about this. Oh Lord, help me. There's a Buddhist technique, which is called mindfulness. And this would be anytime that thought is triggered, like whether it's irritation or anger about, let's say, an incident with your roommate or something, right? Just recognize that the thought is there, that thought of irritation, that feeling of irritation. Just like label it or identify it. And then the moment you do that, the moment you become mindful of that, you cease to identify with that thought. You're not kind of preoccupied with it. You're not completely identified with it. There's a little bit of kind of breathing room between you and that thought or that feeling. And so there's a kind of like you're in a certain sense liberated from it, right? And the more you practice that mindfulness, every time you have a thought, you don't need to think about like fighting with it. You don't even have to say, I need to get rid of it. You don't need to get rid of it. Let it be there, but just don't be bothered with it. And don't identify with it. Just be mindful. There are studies done on mindfulness where they took alcoholics, like severe alcoholics with violent tendencies and this and that, and they told the guy, there's a certain person they had in mind. And they said they didn't call it Buddhist, they didn't even call it mindfulness. They said anytime a desire to drink arises in your mind, just label it. That's the language that they use. Label it. Identify it as a thought to drink, as a desire to drink. And then he did that, and he was completely cured of his alcoholism, actually. But that basically is a Buddhist mindfulness technique, just goes by a different name. So that's another helpful way of dealing with emotional reactivity.
Okay.
Fighting with it, the danger of fighting with these things is that it almost never works. And it ends up with repression. You're just holding it down, but then it'll blow up again. So that's not really helpful. So through prayer, you can sublimate it, you can dissolve it, and through mindfulness, you'll suck it of its power, basically, and its kind of force. You'll deprive it of its force. Yes, other questions?
I had another question.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, quite a lot.
No, don't apologize.
But I was wondering, so when we're talking about like reactivity, often in that moment, like if you're angry, for example, it's probably the easiest. It's very difficult to sort of, I don't even want to use the word control, but it's there's a gut response that sort of happens almost like
it's very physiological too. Yeah.
It just sort of occurs.
Your face turns red and it's like, yeah.
Exactly. So what would you say, like, typically, like, for example, with like an exam or something, they would say, like, try and study beforehand so that when you get to that point of stress, you can like actually perform right. What would you say is sort of like an equivalence with like emotional reactivity in a moment? Are there things you can do when you're in a state of like emotional non-reactivity to better prepare yourself? Or how does that sort of work with like gut responses sort of?
The thing is, I mean, at the highest level, you won't feel that physiological response. There's an example of one of our old monks who was in Mayavati, Bharat Maharaj. He was a great Advaitin, like follower of the traditional path of knowledge, Shankara school. And he was walking in Mayavati, which is our highest Himalayan ashrama, and there were tigers. There still are, I guess, sometimes. He's walking in the woods, and there's a tiger that like just came right in front of him. And then what he did was very unusually, he just went like this, and he checked whether his heart was beating any faster, and he found that it wasn't. And then he just didn't say anything, and the tiger walked away. He didn't mind whether he was going to be eaten or not. He was completely chill about the. I'm not recommending that you don't try this at home, but we'll have one less student at UCLA. But the point is, at the highest level, you won't even feel that gut response. That you get the gut response because you're identified with the body and with the mind, right? Some combination of the psychophysical complex of the body and the mind. When you've broken your identification with that, you won't feel that anymore. So yeah, but where does that leave us who are obviously not at that level? Well, yeah, you'll have that gut response, but the sign of a spiritual aspirant is the moment that you feel that, be aware of it, be mindful of the fact that you're in that state. Because a lot of people are so caught up in that wave of anger that they're so identified with it that they can't recognize that they're in that state. The moment you recognize yourself in the state, you're already, to a certain extent, free from it, right? Oh, I see. The body is reacting in this way. The mind is going crazy. That means you're not the mind and you're not the body. You see what I mean? Yeah. So even that moment of awareness is enough to kind of help you take a step back, to give you to insert a little bit of breathing room between you and that reactive state.
So it's sort of like reducing the response time, if you will, like ensuring that like maybe you can't control the gut response at the moment, but you can like recover from that faster.
How quickly you recover. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you should be honest about the fact, and you can, that's why monks say this could easily be used as a kind of excuse, but we say in Bengali, Sadhu Rag Joled Dag, which means a monk's anger is like a line drawn in the water because it'll go away. That's the ideal, though, is that you might lose your temper. It's like we're all human. But the sign of a true spiritual aspirant is that they don't let it fester, linger, and then they keep thinking about it days later. That person that you're angry at becomes your nemesis for the rest of your life. Like, that's not healthy at all, this kind of stuff.
Common among kids.
To do what? Oh,
they get upset.
But then they forget about it. Yeah, Ramakrishna will say that that's because these little kids are beyond the three gunas. And he'll give these great examples like they have this doll. And there's like an adult who comes like, oh, give me your doll. Like, no, it's my doll. I don't want to give it to you. Like they might seem very so. And then he's like, they might spend all day building this really elaborate sandcastle on the beach. And the next moment, they themselves will just knock it down. And they're like, ah, I don't care. So it's like they're beyond any kind of attachments, and it's very interesting. So the saint, in a certain way, mimics or like looks like on the surface like a 5-year-old child in certain ways, because the saint is also beyond the three gunas, right? Yeah, yeah, good questions actually. Yeah. Anything else? No? Good. All right. So we can end the recording, I guess, and we can talk about what week are you guys in your quarter?